Chester the Brave by Audrey Penn, illustrated by Barbara L. Gibson. This is the front cover of the book, Chester the Brave. Have you read any other books about this little raccoon, Chester? There's another book called The Kissing Hand you might have read already, about Chester the raccoon. Chester goes to school now, but he still gets nervous about certain things that they do at school. And he needs to be brave. Some words that you might hear in this book are bothered. Have you ever heard the word bothered? Bothered means that something makes you upset or scared. Chester is bothered about something in this book, and his mother tells him a story about a little robin and how the little robin was also bothered, but how the little robin learned to be brave. Brave doesn't mean that you're not bothered. Being brave is having the courage to do something, even when you are bothered. Being brave is having the courage to do something that makes you upset or scared. In the book, Chester's mom will tell him that when he needs to be brave and do something that bothers him, he should remember 3 words: think, tell, do. Can you put your finger to your head and say think? Can you put your finger to your lip and say tell? Can you put your fist on your other hand and say do? Remember, if you're bothered and you need to do something that upsets you, you can always think, tell, do. Let's read about Chester the Brave and the story his mom tells him about the robin to see what think, tell, do really means. Here's the first title page of the book. It tells us the title or name of the book again: Chester the Brave. Here's the other title page. It tells us the name again: Chester the Brave. Is Chester looking very brave in this picture? The story is written by author Audrey Penn. That means Audrey Penn wrote the words. It's illustrated by Barbara L. Gibson. If Barbara illustrated the story, that means Barbara drew the pictures in the story. Do you see the 2 robins? The mama robin and the baby robin? I wonder what story Mama Raccoon will tell about the robins. Chester Raccoon sat snuggled in his mother's lap. The last golden rays of sundown shone through their tree hole, and his younger brother Ronnie lay curled up, fast asleep on the far side of their hollow. "This is my very best time," Chester told his mother, lifting his eyes to hers. "This is my very best time, too," she told him sweetly. "Do you still want me to tell you about the little robin?" "Yes, please." "Well," Mrs. Raccoon began her story, "he stepped up to the edge of his nest, bent his little legs, lifted his tiny wings, and said, 'I can't! I'm too afraid!' and hopped back into the safety of his nest." "He was too afraid to fly?" asked Chester. Yes, he was, answered Mrs. Raccoon. Is that little baby robin looking very brave? Chester looked very worried. He dropped his head and stuck out his lower lip. Did the little robin think it was okay to be afraid? He thought it meant he wasn't brave, explained Chester's mother. You see, the little robin's brother and sister flew their very first time, and he thought that meant they were very brave. And if they were very brave, he thought it meant he wasn't. Chester appeared very upset. Was he right? asked his mother. He asked his mother. What do you think? If the little robin is very upset, does it mean that he's not brave? Mrs. Raccoon smoothed out the fur on top of Chester's head. Well, the little robin's father told him that it wasn't that his brother and sister were brave. It was the fact that they simply weren't bothered. Chester lifted his head and peered up at his mother. What does that mean? Mrs. Raccoon laughed. The little robin wasn't sure what it meant either. So his father asked him if he was bothered when he was eating worms. What do birds like to eat? Worms. So do you think the little robin is bothered when he eats worms? Let's turn the page and find out. Ooh, yuck! Shrieked Chester. That's disgusting. What did he say? He said he wasn't bothered eating worms at all. He said he loved eating worms, especially the big, long, thick, stretchy kind. Oh, blech! Bleated Chester. His nose and mouth twisted and squished together, and his entire body shuddered. Eating worms would bother me. But what do birds like to eat? Worms. So it didn't bother this robin. Mrs. Raccoon nodded. It would bother me too, she confessed. Then the little robin's father asked him if he was bothered when he was singing. And the little birdie began tweeting, 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 and said he wasn't bothered when he was singing at all. Singing is another thing that robins like to do, so he's not upset or bothered when he's singing. Singing is a lot better than eating worms, grimaced Chester. I agree, said Mrs. Raccoon. Then the little bird's father told him that being brave wasn't about flying when he wasn't bothered to fly. Being brave was about flying when he was bothered to fly, but found the courage to fly anyway, because he knew he must. So can you still be brave even when you're bothered? Yes, you can still be brave even when you're bothered. You just have to find the courage to do the thing that's bothering you. Then his father asked him if he was bothered when he was reciting his flying lessons in front of all the other little birdies who nested in our tree. The poor little robin got all aflutter. Do you think the robin is bothered when he has to talk out loud in front of the other birds? He hopped up and down and flapped his wings just like he did the time the skunk sprayed our tree from down below. The little robin said that reciting his lessons in front of all the other little birds was the worst thing he ever had to do in his whole life. Does the little bird look bothered here? But when the teacher asks you to do something, do you get to just ignore the teacher? Suddenly, Chester began to tremble, and he nestled deeper into his mother's soft, comforting arms. You see him nestling into her arms? "What's the matter?" his mother asked. What do you think is the matter with Chester when he hears this part of the story? Reciting lessons in front of the other animals at Owl's teacher's school is the worst thing I have ever had to do in my whole life, too, he whimpered. "Is that so?" asked Mrs. Raccoon. She gave Chester a reassuring hug and then took his tiny hand in hers and gently kissed the center of his palm. "Shall I tell you what happened to the little robin, or would you rather jump on top of Ronnie and wake him up for school?" Chester giggled. "I want to know what happened to the robin." Well, the very next day, the little robin's mother tucked one of her own tiny flight feathers into his wing and told him it was for good luck. So even though he was still bothered about reciting his lessons, the tiny bird stood in front of all the other birdies in our tree and twittered, "I lift my head to the clouds. I push off with my feet. I flap my wings and let the gentle breeze take me for a ride." Gulp. Was the little birdie bothered about reciting his lessons out loud? Yes, he was. But did he find the courage to say what he needed to say anyway? That is what being brave is all about. And while he was still afraid to fly, he found the courage he needed and said to himself, "I am very brave." Even though he's bothered, he's being brave. Then he stepped up to the edge of the nest, spread his wings, pushed off with his feet, and flew away. After all, he was a very brave little robin. "Hooray!" clapped Chester. "Do you know what I think being brave is?" asked Mrs. Raccoon. Chester shook his head. "I think being brave is about 3 little words. Think, tell, do. If you think you can't, tell yourself you can and do it." Mrs. Raccoon lifted Chester's hand. "Can you see my kiss in your palm?" Chester laughed. "No." "Well, you know it's there, and it's for luck, just like the robin's little feather." You see that it's getting dark outside? What do raccoons do when it gets dark outside? Chester jumped off his mother's lap, bent his knees, opened his arms, and yelled, "I am very brave!" Then he ran to the other side of the hollow and with a flying leap landed on top of his brother. "Wake up, Ronnie! It's time for school! Chester the Brave has a speech to make." Why do you think Chester's mother told him the story about the robin? Is it possibly because Chester has the same fear and needs to find courage just like the robin needed to find courage? Later that night, Chester Raccoon stood on a branch at Owl Teacher's school. He remembered what his mother said about think, tell, do. If I think I can't, I tell myself I can and do it. And he found the courage he needed to tell himself, "I am very brave." Then he opened his hand, and there in the middle of his palm was his mother's gentle kiss for good luck. And even though Chester was still the tiniest bit afraid, he recited his lesson in front of all the other animals. After all, Chester is a very brave little raccoon. You see all the other nocturnal animals that go to Mr. Owl's night school. I hope that if you find something that bothers you, makes you scared, and you don't want to do it, that you'll be able to find the courage to think, tell, do. If you think you can't, tell yourself you can, and do it. You can be brave just like Chester the Brave.